I didn't move into the house to make friends. At 45, freshly divorced and just trying to create a new chapter for my 2 kids, friendships weren't high on my list. I had a simple goal: provide some stability for Amy, who was 12 and a little too smart for her age, and Ethan, who was 9 and still clung to my side at night. Our small cul-de-sac in a sleepy Ohio suburb seemed perfect for that. The move happened in early spring. The kind of spring where everything is trying to bloom but still looks like it's struggling. Boxes were unpacked slowly, routine trips to Home Depot became the weekend activity, and I found myself navigating this new life with its small victories. The first dinner we had in our kitchen, the first time Amy asked to have a friend over from her new school. I'll admit, I didn't pay much attention to my neighbors at first. People came and went, waving politely, but everyone kept to themselves. The houses were close together. Standard suburban development, neatly lined fences with a few bushes dividing the backyards. But Mr. Hensley was different. He lived alone in the house right next door, and he was the kind of guy who never really smiled, even when waving. It started with small things, oddities that seemed innocent enough. I'd take the trash out at night and notice Mr. Hensley digging in his backyard. He'd be there, kneeling next to one of those oversized gardening bins, shovel in hand, under the dim light of his porch. A strange sight, sure, but some people garden at night. I chalked it up to him being quirky. A few weeks after moving in, Ethan mentioned something strange. He tugged at my shirt while I was loading dishes, whispering, "Dad, I heard someone talking by the fence." I paused, glancing out the kitchen window that faced the backyard. "Talking?" I asked, not really thinking much of it. "Yeah, like whispers," he said, looking uncomfortable. "It's creepy." I tried to laugh it off, telling him it was probably the wind or someone walking their dog. But then Amy chimed in, her arms crossed and her tone far more serious. "It's true, Dad. I heard it too, right near the fence." She shot a glance out the window as if expecting to see someone standing there. I didn't think much of it. Kids get scared easily, especially after a big move. But then I started noticing it myself. Hensley's nightly digging wasn't just an occasional thing. It was every night. He'd be out there with a shovel, making deep holes, then filling them up by morning. And there was never anything planted. No flowers, no trees, just holes. Every morning the ground looked freshly disturbed. The kids began to avoid the backyard. They'd stay inside or go play out front, avoiding the fence entirely. I finally decided to ask Hensley about it. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he was out on his porch when I approached. I remember the way he looked at me, his eyes narrow, like he was sizing me up. "Hey, Mr. Hensley," I called over, trying to keep my tone light. "Been doing a lot of gardening lately?" He stopped what he was doing and stared at me for a moment before giving a small, humorless smile. "Just preparing for a storm," he said, his voice raspy. Then he turned his back to me and went inside, leaving me standing there like an idiot. "Preparing for a storm?" I muttered under my breath. There wasn't any storm in the forecast. It didn't make sense. One afternoon, not long after, Ethan came running inside, his face flushed. "Dad, look what I found." He held out a small, dirty shoe. It was old, maybe decades old, and child-sized. The kind that buttoned up on the side, like something from a different era. "Where did you get this?" I asked, frowning. "By the fence," Ethan said, pointing. The ground was really soft, so I started digging a little. A chill ran down my spine. I went outside to where Ethan had pointed, and sure enough, the earth was loose. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt, my fingers uncovering something small and metallic, a locket. I turned it over in my hand, feeling a growing sense of unease. That night, our dog, Baxter, went missing. He was an old retriever, slow and gentle, not the kind to wander off. We searched the entire neighborhood, calling his name until it was too late to keep looking. The next morning, Mr. Hensley was out by his fence. He looked over at me as I stepped outside and said, "Sorry about your dog. Some things just wander where they shouldn't." His words were deliberate, his gaze cold. I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the digging, the whispers, the shoe, and the way Hensley seemed to always be watching. Around midnight, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a shovel from the garage and went outside, keeping my footsteps quiet as I approached the fence line. I started digging where I had seen Hensley digging before, near the back of the yard, under the old oak tree. The soil was soft, easy to move. Too easy. About 2 feet down, I hit something. My heart pounded as I cleared away the dirt. It was a small box, wooden, with strange symbols carved into it. I pried it open, and inside were bones, animal bones, and other things. A rusted pocket knife, a stuffed toy, and a tangle of necklaces. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't make sense, but it felt wrong, like I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft rustling from the other side of the fence. I looked up and saw Hensley standing there watching me. "You shouldn't be digging," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I'm trying to keep it contained." "Keep what contained?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back to his house, disappearing into the shadows. The next day, I called the police. They came, took a look, and shrugged it off, said it was probably some kind of weird hobby, maybe even a prank. They left without doing much of anything. But I knew better. I knew there was something wrong with that yard, with Hensley, with everything that had been happening. A week later, I saw a moving truck in front of Hensley's house. He was leaving, just like that. No goodbyes, no explanation. I watched from my window as he loaded the last of his things, his face expressionless. Before he left, he caught my eye and gave me a slow nod, almost like a warning. After he was gone, the whispers stopped. The kids started playing in the backyard again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Hensley had been doing, it wasn't over. Not really. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear something. A faint rustling near the fence, like someone digging. And I wonder if whatever he was trying to bury is still out there, waiting. Story 2. I'd lived in that apartment for 2 years, always appreciating its charm, creaky floors and all, but it wasn't until the new tenant moved upstairs that I started keeping a hammer under my bed. The first time I heard it, I figured it was just an old building settling, maybe the pipes knocking around. The rhythmic thumping came at random intervals, late at night, too mechanical to be footsteps, too perfectly spaced to be natural. At first, I ignored it. You get used to weird noises when you live in a converted brownstone, and Boston's January chill made every floorboard groan and radiator hiss. I told myself it was nothing. Still, the hammer went from the toolbox to under my bed, just in case. A few days later, I met him, the new tenant. I was heading out to grab groceries, my breath visible in the cold, and there he was, standing in the hallway like he was waiting for me. "Hi," he said, his voice just a little too high-pitched, his eyes a little too wide. He introduced himself as Mark. Something about his smile felt wrong, forced. He didn't blink much. I shook his hand, noticing how clammy it felt, and muttered something about how nice it was to meet him before hurriedly leaving. I caught him staring through my window that same night, his face a shadow just beyond the glass. I closed the curtains and decided not to think about it. I work from home, freelancing as a graphic designer, which means I'm around a lot to see packages coming and going. Mark got a lot of packages. I'd see them stacked outside his door almost every other day, labeled with different names, different addresses, none of them his. Once, one of the packages had a dark stain on the bottom, and as I walked past, I caught a metallic smell. My mind flickered to the thought of blood, but I shut it down quickly. "It's paint," I told myself. "Ink. Anything else?" The smell got worse. By the end of January, the hallway had this cloying, foul stench that lingered in the air like something rotting. I heard it again one night, The thumping. Only this time, it was followed by a dragging noise. I crept to my door, peering through the peephole. There was Mark, dragging a heavy black bag down the stairs. The kind of bag that looked like it could hold anything. He paused, looking up towards my door, and for a split second, I swear he smiled, as if he knew I was watching. My stomach dropped. He continued dragging the bag, disappearing into the dark. That night, I called the police. They came by, talked to Mark briefly, then left. I watched from my window as Mark waved at me, his smile too wide, teeth glinting in the dim light. A few days later, my cat went missing. Muffin never wandered far, always sticking to the apartment or the little fenced garden out back. I searched everywhere, under the bed, in closets, calling her name through the empty hallways. Nothing. Then I saw it. Tufts of fur near my door, and a note, a piece of lined paper torn from a notebook slipped just beneath the frame. "You're next," it read in shaky scrawled letters. I packed a bag. I wasn't going to stick around to see what happened next. I threw everything I could into a duffel, grabbed my keys, and ran to my car. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine clicked, sputtered, then fell silent. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the lot, watching me. Mark. His head tilted slightly, his eyes wide and unblinking. I knew I had no choice. I had to confront him. I stormed back into the building, up the stairs, and pounded on his door. He opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. He just smiled, stepping aside, motioning for me to come in. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb in the kitchen. I could see the black bags, several of them, lined up against the far wall. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the hammer in my pocket. "You don't understand," Mark said, his voice eerily calm. "I'm not your enemy." He pointed towards the floor, towards the vent that led to the basement. "He is." Before I could react, there was a noise from below, a deep, guttural sound, like something scraping against metal. Mark moved quickly, grabbing one of the black bags and dragging it towards the vent. "I've been keeping him down there," he said, his voice strained. "Keeping you safe." It all happened in a blur. The vent bursting open, a shadowy figure lunging out, Mark swinging the bag, knocking it back. I ran. I didn't look back, not until I was out of the building, the cold January air biting at my face. I heard screams, the sounds of struggle echoing up through the open windows. And then, silence. The police found Mark's body the next day, but they never found the other man. They told me it was a break-in gone wrong, that Mark was a victim. But I knew better. I moved out that same week, leaving behind the creaky floors, the charm, and the horrors that lived beneath them. And now, every night, I still keep a hammer under my bed, just in case. Story 3. My name is Luke, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a barista during the day and spend my nights trying to build a writing career. I live in a small rental house in Portland. Nothing special, just a modest little place that somehow manages to feel like mine. It's late October, and the days are already getting shorter. I live alone, but I've always liked it that way. I enjoy the freedom, the quiet, the routine. The house across the street was supposed to be empty. The owners had moved out months ago, and it had been sitting on the market for a while. Occasionally, I'd see realtors stop by or a potential buyer tour the place. But it had been quiet for a long time. That's why I didn't think much of it when I first saw a light on over there, until I realized it was moving. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe some leftover timer or a realtor making a late stop, but something about it kept gnawing at me. I remember that first night clearly. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting in my living room trying to untangle the plot of the short story I was working on. The rain outside was gentle, tapping against the window. I happened to glance out, half expecting to see nothing, just darkness. Instead, I saw that faint light drifting from room to room. It almost looked like a flashlight. I tried to brush it off, but the way it moved, slowly, as if someone was pacing through the empty house, kept me on edge. The next day at the cafe, I couldn't get it out of my head. I asked my coworker, Michelle, if she'd heard anything about someone moving in across the street. She shrugged and gave me that wry smile of hers. Maybe a ghost tenant? It's October after all, she joked, but I didn't laugh. Something felt off, and I couldn't shake it. I'm not typically a paranoid guy, but the unease stayed with me all day. A couple of nights later, I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A delivery van stopped in front of the house around 2 a.m. The driver, I couldn't make out his face, hopped out and unloaded something, then vanished inside. I got up, crossed my living room, and tried to see through the rain-streaked windows, but the darkness swallowed the rest of the scene. The van left just as quickly as it had come, and by the time I mustered the courage to step outside for a closer look, everything was quiet again. I told myself to let it go, but that sense of dread, of something happening just out of sight, wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to focus on my writing, but even the clicking of my keyboard started to feel like background noise, drowned out by my own thoughts. Things escalated when a package appeared on my porch one morning. There was no return address, no label, just a plain cardboard box. It was small, almost like it could hold a book or a picture frame. I brought it inside, curious but wary, and opened it on my kitchen table. Inside, there was just one thing: a Polaroid photo. I flipped it over, and my stomach twisted. It was a photo of my living room, taken from outside, a perfect shot through the window where I often sat to write. I called the police. They took down my statement, nodded, and assured me they'd look into it, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. The officer told me it was probably just a prank. They left, and I tried to convince myself that maybe they were right. Maybe it was just some stupid kid messing around. But then I heard it. Footsteps in the attic, directly above my bedroom, late that same night. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might explode. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a wrench I'd been meaning to return to my toolbox, and crept upstairs. The attic door was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The dark, musty air enveloped me as I fumbled for the light string. When it flicked on, I saw nothing, just insulation and some old boxes, no signs of anyone. The police came again, found no evidence of forced entry, and left me with more assurances. But I knew what I heard. A week later, I saw the figure. It was late, again, and I was lying in bed, trying to read. I glanced out my bedroom window, and there it was, standing in the upstairs window of the house across the street. The figure was still, almost like a mannequin, except I recognized the hoodie it was wearing. It was mine. A worn, gray hoodie I hadn't been able to find for days. My mouth went dry, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I had to confront whoever was in that house. I waited until morning, and then, when I felt the neighborhood was as awake as it could be, I crossed the street. My hands shook as I approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The house was dark inside, the kind of dark that feels heavy, oppressive. The living room was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied, like someone had just stepped out. My eyes scanned the room until they landed on something that made my stomach turn. On the mantel above the fireplace, there was a line of Polaroids, each one of my house, of me. There was one of me in the kitchen, one of me on my porch, one of me asleep in my bed. My vision blurred, and I took a shaky step back, the floor creaking under my weight. That's when I heard movement upstairs. I ran. I didn't look back, not even as I reached my front door and slammed it shut behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath ragged. I called the police again, my voice cracking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. They came, and this time, they took me seriously. They found signs that someone had been squatting in the house, sleeping bags, empty food containers, but whoever it was had already fled. Days later, I was going through my things, trying to see if anything else was missing. That's when I noticed it, a Polaroid taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet. It was a picture of me, asleep in my bed, taken from inside my room. The police still don't know who was in that house or why they were targeting me. I moved out a month later, left Portland altogether. But even now, in my new apartment, hundreds of miles away, I still check the windows every night. I still feel that lingering sense of dread, that feeling that someone is watching, waiting, just out of sight.